Thank you so much. You know, I realized last night, and I realized this morning, and actually I realize it practically every day of my life, how fortunate I am to have been working for the last 40 years with the most wonderful people on God's earth, and that's you. You know, when we were standing around taking photos, and what struck me is that the smiles on your face and the energy you were communicating is a reflection of something really, really good and really powerful. And we need you here in this country and everywhere. And I think we especially need you when we as a society are experiencing such deep levels of distrust and polarization. There's a lot of work to do out there, but if anybody can do it, it's you. And you know, I'm going to talk this morning about the origins of the program and the nurses who were involved in really developing it. And I especially want to acknowledge this morning Lynn Scazafabo, who has traveled here all the way from Kent, England, with her husband, Peter, to join us this week. And so, Lynn, we have a little award for you for all of your contributions to the development of the NFP, and I'm hoping that you would be willing to come up and accept this award, and our deep, deep gratitude for all of the work that you and the other nurses did in developing the NFP. I hope you'll have a chance to talk to Lynn over the next few days, because she has such deep insights. And like all of the original nurses who served in this program, they've gone on to serve pregnant women and parents of young children in their careers following the work we did together in Elmira, New York. And I just can't tell you, Lynn, how grateful I am for your input and guidance about the development of this program. And with that, I realize I think I'm supposed to have a clicker, and maybe it was given to me, but Gloria, did you, where is it? Oh, okay. And by the way, Gloria, does it count that my wife does yoga? It does?
But those are her muscles.
Okay. All righty. Thank you. You know, we've been at this for 40 years. And I think in some ways, this work that we are all here to celebrate can be really distilled into some very fundamental principles. And they are really clinical excellence. I think that because of Lynn and Georgie and Liz's and Diane's and Jackie's contributions to this early work, the program that we collectively are delivering is grounded in really deep, thoughtful clinical excellence. And the reason, and that's fundamentally why the program works. And it's not that we have all the answers. We don't. This is going to constantly be a work in progress, as you'll see in a moment. As you all know, it doesn't work with everybody. There are ways that we need to make adaptations, and there are things that fall short. But It's good. It's really good. And it's because of your continuous kind of challenging of all of us. I was on the phone yesterday with a colleague, and she started to apologize for challenging me. And I said, boy, please don't apologize. We need feedback. We need critical insights. We need your critical insights. We are a team. We are in this together. No one has all the right answers. We're a big team, and each of us plays a different role in getting us across the goal line. And so it plays a different role in getting us across the goal line. So I just think it's really important that we carry forward our work with the knowledge that we are together on this. The other principle that's guided this work from the beginning is that we need to ground this work in the highest levels of science, rigorous evidence as possible. When we began this work back in the 1970s, there were some people who said to me, you can't even really conduct a scientifically grounded, randomized clinical trial of a complex program like this. It's just not even possible. And, you know, we took the position that this guy may be right. And so we took the time to think through exactly what it would take, what are the kinds of challenges that these kinds of studies encounter that would compromise the scientific integrity. And as you know, the first trial conducted in Elmira showed a lot of promise, but there were a lot of things that there were a lot of questions that remained, and so we conducted a second trial and a third trial to start sorting out these issues. And that, honestly, that kind of shared commitment to scientific integrity is fundamental to this work. And part of it is that there is in putting our work to rigorous scientific tests means that we are approaching this work with a lot of humility, because we don't know for sure. Will there be short-term effects? Will there be effects on breastfeeding, or on injuries, or on adolescent crime, and so forth? We don't know. We didn't know. And you know, good science really depends on replication. And so that takes time. I think that it's important for us to recognize that developing something of quality takes time. And the other piece, fundamental piece on this, I think, is shared accountability. We have accountability to the families we serve. We have accountability to those who are funding this work, whether it's the public or private philanthropies. And we have an accountability to our teammates and to the families we serve. And all of that burdensome data, by the way, we're going to make it easier, I think, collectively, to enter those data into the new system, the flow system. But it's crucial to guide us, to let us know whether we're really on track and where we may be coming up short, and to guide us in thinking about what we may need to do to make it even stronger. And you know something, taking a program from a set of relatively tightly controlled experimental settings, and then to replicate it for now hundreds of thousands of families is a huge undertaking. And there are all kinds of challenges in doing that. We're moving with new nursing teams and new population served and new community context, organizational context. How do we preserve the essential elements of a program when we start replicating it in all of those different kinds of contexts? That kind of shared commitment to mutual accountability is fundamental to this work. Okay. But it really begins with those original 3 trials. First in Elmira, New York, conducted with a sample of primarily low income, primarily white families living in a semi-rural community. The organization that delivered the program, the original program, was funded through the Appalachian Regional Commission. The southern tier of New York is part of Appalachia, and it has culture and demographics that are not unlike Kentucky and Tennessee and Georgia, so forth. It's important to keep that in mind. Also, the study was conducted after a devastating flood. Those of you from North Carolina will understand this. Hit the community, flooded it. The economic conditions in the Elmira metropolitan area were considered the worst. It was the worst standard metropolitan area in the country in terms of its economic conditions. It had the highest rates of child abuse and neglect in all of New York State, in both reported and substantiated cases. The conditions for caring for children were not great. The findings from the original trial were really very promising, but they were limited to white families, primarily. And so we needed to know whether this program could work similar kinds of effects if it were serving low-income African-American families in a major urban area. So we replicated this study with a much larger sample in Memphis, Tennessee. And again, the findings, while not perfectly aligned, I won't go into all the details about why that might be the case, fundamentally replicated the findings from Elmira. And then people said to us, well, you know, you got a program that works, let's make it more widely available. And by the way, if you were just to hire people from the community to do this work, you would get even greater effects because there would be reduced social distance. If you could hire community health workers to do this work, they would do even better than nurses. And so we took the position, you may be right about that. So we need to conduct a scientifically controlled study that allows us to systematically randomize families to a control group, to a group visited by nurses, and a group visited by paraprofessionals, and then see what the outcomes are. Well, I'm going to cut to the chase when it comes to that trial. Nurses produce effects that are twice as large, and families open their doors more frequently for nurses than they do for paraprofessionals or community health type workers. So, and you know something, it has to do with both who you are as individuals, but the skill set that you bring to the table with pregnant women and parents of young children. And it's just important that we keep that in mind. And the benefits in both Elmira and Memphis were more pronounced, where there were overlapping sociodemographic risks and where the mothers themselves were least capable of dealing with the social adversities that they were having to contend with. Now, all of this can be traced back to the Elmira team. And here are the nurses who were working in the Elmira program. Jackie Roberts, Lynn Scazafabo, whom you just met, Liz Chilson, Georgie McGrady, and Diane Farr. One of the things that was really, I think, important in understanding the effects of the Elmira program is that Lynn and Liz were partners. They formed a sub-team. They got to know one another's families. They would go on visits together. They would spell one another off. During their office time in the morning, they would have an opportunity to talk with one another. How about how it's going with Susie Jones? And to support one another emotionally. That kind of partnership within their team, I think, is really crucial for preventing nurse burnout and keeping motivation high, and it's something that we have not systematically replicated. It was not replicated in the Memphis program, and I think it's something that we should give serious thought to as we go forward. And here are some of us together. I don't know whether this points. And I don't know. Okay, the person on your far right is Diane Farr. My hand is on her shoulder. The person right in front of Diane is Georgie McGrady. You may have seen Georgie because she was featured on one of the Newslink articles in the last couple of months. And just to the left of the woman, the other woman who's Janice is Liz Chilson. Lynn is not in this picture, and neither are Jackie. But I wanted to share this with you, and this reminded me, when I looked at this photo, it reminded me of the photos that we all were taking last night at the reception together. There's such joy. There's such energy. The positive affect that drives this work is just unmatched. It's something that we need to celebrate and need to carry forward and remember that both we are in this together and we are doing good work. And what grew out of this early work in Elmira, for me at least, is enduring lessons. And by the way, let me just be clear about the Elmira program. When we began this work, I had some highfalutin theories. I had some general ideas about what we ought to do, but it was Liz and Georgie and Diane and Lynn and Jackie who took those ideas and formulated them into detailed guidelines, outlines of what should be covered at the beginning of pregnancy, what in the middle of pregnancy, what at the end of pregnancy, what in the newborn period. It forms the foundation of the visit-by-visit guidelines and facilitators that we have to deliver today. And it's really attributable to Lynn and the rest of the members of the team for that wonderful content and those insights about how we should do this work well. So you have those original Elmira nurses to thank for this. And it's not just the content, but it is what I think are so fundamental features of the program, and so much of what we did in Elmira is our continuing task as we deliver the program nationally and internationally today. And that can be distilled into some of these fundamental issues, and I'm sure I'll miss some of them, Lynn, and you can correct me, please. But I think they have to do with things like listening for mothers' and fathers' hopes and fears. It's crucial. It's the foundation on which all of this is built. And by listening, we are going to discover for mothers and fathers their deepest heart's desire. And you know what that is. It's to protect their baby. And it has to do with respect. Really respecting this mother and this father as individuals, but also respecting them given their histories and their context and the struggles they've had and what they've overcome. That respect is really fundamental. And out of that respect and that listening, you will communicate care. That's what nursing is all about fundamentally, right? Caring. And in that context, you will begin to have the foundation for reflecting with mothers and fathers and grandmothers and other family members about how they might be able to find a way to address their hopes and address their fears with goal setting and activities that will get them closer to what they dream of, what they want. And you can provide guidance. As nurses, you have knowledge, you have insights, you have experience, and pregnant women and parents of young children know that. Another thing that I think is really crucial in all of this is being yourself. I know that, Lynn, I don't know that you remember this, but I remember Georgie saying, you know, for these young mothers, they can spot a phony a mile away. That was what she would say. And so the members of our Elmira team were very different in their personality characteristics. Lynn was caring and had this intellect that was really, I think, the crucial for our team composition. Diane was kind of reserved and quiet and caring. Georgie was right out there. And boy, she let you know exactly what was going on. And Liz also had some of that kind of reserve quality. Jackie had this combination of leadership skills and reflective capacities. And so each of the nurses was very different, but collectively, we, I think, could create something really powerful. We had each week a case conference on Friday mornings where we would bring cases together. And I was there in the basement of this elementary school in Elmira, where I'd have a chance to reflect on these cases with the nurse team and start formulating ideas about how we could address those issues in accordance with the underlying theoretical model of the program. And boy, did I learn things. Among the things that that also became really clear was how critical it is to lead with mothers and families' strengths. You know, so many of the young mothers in the program have had nothing but criticism in their lives. They've had everyone tell them how they're doing it wrong. So let's find, if we're going to really engage them, let's lead with strengths. And also, and I think it might have been you, Lynn, when you all put together the details of this visit, the program, you came back to me and said, there's no way we can deliver all of these programs, all of these visits to all of our families. It's too much. And so I remember saying to you all, then we have to make adjustments. You need to find a way to make sure that those who are most vulnerable are getting as much of the program as we can deliver, and that we can, for the lower risk families, drop off the frequency and the dosage of the program, but also in a way, because the program was structured as an outline rather than detailed visit-by-visit guidelines, it created some flexibility in how nurses would take this content and use it to address families' needs. So some of the principles that we are espousing in the program today really can be traced right back to those original Elmira experiences. And that includes the focus on physical assessments. Nurses in the Elmira program took blood pressures and did Eurosticks and did heights and weights and babies. And they were applying their physical assessment skills in the context of home visits. It's a way of, it does two things. I mean, most importantly, honestly, is that it helps women, helps nurses identifying the emerging signs of hypertensive disorders of pregnancy. Are blood pressures spiking? Is there swelling? Is there protein in the urine? These are the kinds of symptoms that need to be discussed with primary care providers. And honestly, we see in 2 separate randomized clinical trials of the program that nurse-visited women at delivery had fewer rates of hypertensive disorders of pregnancy. Why is that? Well, I think part of it has to do with both the reduction in stress. Stress contributes to elevated blood pressure, but all of those things that nurses were doing in terms of a physical assessment and communicating with the OBs contributed to that. This is a fundamental feature of the program. The involvement of fathers and family members was part of the theoretical underpinnings of the program, and it's remarkable to me how much fathers can care. Fathers can be controlling, and there are concerns with intimate partner violence. But boy, are we overlooking the opportunities to really do good work unless we're really engaging fathers. I remember in Memphis going out on some early home visits, and I have to say that I have to admit to having a certain kind of prejudice almost, thinking, oh, fathers in these contexts aren't really going to be engaged and so forth. And I went out on this visit with this nurse and with this teenage mother and the father, and he was so incredibly aligned and committed. And boy, did that teach me something. It really helped me break down my stereotypes about what it means to be a teen father in an inner city African-American community. There's an opportunity here that we need to continue to plumb. And then teamwork. I had already mentioned how the nurses in Elmira worked in partnership, and we had teams. The success of the program grew out of sensitive, reflective teamwork, and the ability for these partners on these sub-teams to work with one another day in and day out and support one another. That kind of teamwork is really crucial. And the other piece is community collaboration. We set up as part of the model community advisory boards. In the original Elmira program, we had a community advisory board made up of representatives from the health department, the obstetricians' offices, pediatricians' offices, the county mental health, county department of social services and child welfare, the public education system. We had a group of mothers, grandmother types, who were knitting booties and blankets for mothers and their newborns in the community. There was a deep sense that this was a community effort. Crucial, I think. And also, when I began the work in Elmira, I was just doing it out of a nonprofit organization, and then I developed a faculty appointment at Cornell as an adjunct faculty member. And then in 1984, I moved to the University of Rochester to join the Department of Pediatrics. And in that context, I got to know the most amazing colleague that I've had over this long period of my career in Harriet Kitzman. Harriet is a nurse, a researcher, a clinician. She was instrumental nationally in developing the nurse practitioner program with Loretta Ford. In designing the Harriet was critical in designing the Memphis trial. She would travel regularly to Memphis to meet with all of you. Some of you nurses from Memphis, are you here? Where? I'm sure you're here, right? Yay, all right. She went monthly to Memphis to work with the original Memphis nurses, and took. So and it was not just the program. She was a major influence on the science of the Memphis trial. And critically, when she looked at what we were doing in Elmira, and she said, "This is good, but we can make this align more completely with the nursing profession and with nursing education." And so she took these concepts and reformulated them into the form that you all are learning today, the content areas that align with the way nurses are prepared for their roles. That's Harriet. And she personally led the early work on developing the program, translating it into visit-by-visit guidelines. Now, why is that important? In some ways, it's really critical, because as we were educating more nurses and as we were beginning to move the program outside of this context where Lynn and Georgie and Liz and Diane and Jackie and I would sit around and talk about this stuff, we needed to have something that was replicable. And that early work on developing the visit-by-visit guidelines is really Harriet's contribution to this. And while I was at the University of Rochester, we were invited by the Colorado Trust here in Denver to conduct a third trial of the program that would include an examination of the relative impact of the program when delivered by nurses versus paraprofessionals. And Harriet played a role while I was at the University of Rochester in starting to think through what that design of the Denver trial might look like. Soon after that, I was recruited to come to the University of Colorado to join the faculty here. But Harriet has been really critical, a critical colleague, maybe the most sustained collaborator of mine since the Memphis trial work. And today, and I started putting this slide together, and I was thinking all of the nurses I could list. And it would take the hour that I had for my presentation to go through all of the nurses. So I ultimately decided I was going to just hit on some of those critical leaders who've been involved in this work over the last 20 years, including Pilar Baca. Many of you know Pilar. She was the supervisor in the Denver trial of the nursing team. She went on to lead the early national replication of the program and supporting the nurses. Ellie Yost, of course. Yeah. Ellie amazes me. And then I know that those of you from Colorado know Michelle Neal, who directs the NFP in Colorado, and who is truly an amazing nurse with someone who has great insight. Molly O'Fallon, who's a nurse and directs the program quality work at the national office, and of course, Kate Segrist. We are so fortunate, Kate, in your joining the leadership of the program, but through the national office. Such deep insight and passion about doing this work well. And then all of you who are educators and consultants and supervisors are all part of this big team. And one of the great things that Ellie did in recent years was to create the Innovations Advisory Committee. That's, in a way, formalizing the kind of function that the Elmira nurses did with us in that very first trial, and that is to challenge us to to look at the way things are going well and not so well. How can we make this stronger? You know, there are over 100 nurses involved in the Innovations Advisory Committee, and they are dedicated to this program and getting it right. It's an amazing thing, I think. I mean, that's a reflection of the kind of passion and insight that we need collectively to make this work even better over time. And all of you in this room, all of us are part of this huge team. Each of us is playing a slightly different role, but we're all on the same team. We need one another. Now, let me take a moment and just take a second to kind of just review with you from our original trials some of the key lessons. We found that the program could improve prenatal health, including replicated effects on smoking reduction during pregnancy, replicated effects on reducing the rates of hypertensive disorders, replicated effects on reducing preterm delivery and low birth weight in particular vulnerable segments of the population, reductions in children's injuries, and most importantly, reductions in hospitalizations for serious injuries. Injuries is a really hard thing to measure, and the reason for that is it really depends on how health systems are functioning. And given the way primary care is structured, and given the way access to primary care and emergency department facilities is structured nationally and internationally, this is an issue in England, we cannot simply depend upon primary care encounters for injuries or even emergency department encounters for injuries, because there's evidence to indicate that nurse-visited families are taking their babies in for emergency care or to the doctors for low-level emergencies because of their heightened concern about whether their babies are okay. And that's the way it should work. What really is the best indicator of reduction in injuries is hospitalizations for injuries and length of time that babies were hospitalized with injuries, because that's an indication of the severity of their injuries. And if you look carefully at the diagnoses associated with the hospitalizations for injuries in the Memphis trial, it's because of serious things like broken long bones, other types of conditions that suggest that the babies were likely abused or neglected. And that's why you don't see on this list the impact of the program on child maltreatment, because for me, it's you got to have. It's also one of these tricky outcomes. We see significant reductions in the rates of state-verified reports of child abuse and neglect in the Elmira trial, but we also know that nurse-visited children were identified as having been abused and neglected at lower thresholds of severity because of the nurse's involvement with those families and their ethical and legal responsibility to make sure that those families were identified through the child welfare system, child protective services, before they became, before they were seriously injured or killed. But if you look at the evidence from the Memphis trial, what you see is indications that the children, when you look at the hospitalization records, it looks like the nurse visited group was abusing and neglecting their children less than their counterparts in the control group. And that's why a really authoritative review of the child maltreatment literature internationally has identified the nurse-family partnership as having the strongest evidence of any in the world that it prevents maltreatment. I just don't list it but I can talk with you about it. We see consistent effects on children's language and school readiness and cognitive functioning that's replicated across trials, but it's replicated for those children born to mothers who are least capable of caring for themselves or their babies, by virtue of their having higher rates of depression and anxiety and emotional dysregulation, limited sense of control over their life circumstances, and limited intellectual functioning. It's these mothers who have the combination of all of those personal vulnerabilities that under conditions of adversity are least capable of protecting themselves or their babies. And it's that group that you all help the most, and it's that group where we see the greatest reduction in serious injuries to children reflected of maltreatment. It's that group that shows the greatest reduction in state-verified reports of child abuse and neglect in the Elmira trial. We're going to pick that theme up in just a while here. We see significant replicated effects on children's behavioral problems when they enter school. We see significant reductions in young adolescents in their self-reports of depression and anxiety. We see significant reductions in children's self-reports of substance use in the early half of adolescence. We see significant replicated effects on mothers' behavioral impairment due to their own substance use. And we see consistent effects across all three trials in reducing the rates of closely spaced subsequent pregnancies and corresponding reductions in welfare or cash assistance welfare, Medicaid, and food stamp use across two of the three trials, and short-term effects on improvements in employment. And by the way, a recent paper reported in the journal Child Maltreatment indicates that the long-term effects of the program in Elmira on reducing the rates of maltreatment can be linked to better pregnancy planning and improvements in economic conditions. So all of these forces that you are addressing come together to produce outcomes that are important in their own right, but also set the stage for life course, hopefully, life course changes in maternal and child health. We don't know the answer to that yet, but we're working on it. Now, in 1996, 19 years after we began this work, I've been invited by the U.S. Justice Department to set up the program in high crime neighborhoods. And we had resisted invitations to set up the program outside of research contexts until that time point. And even then, I took a deep breath because honestly, I wasn't sure that we could take this precious program and replicate it reliably in new communities. It's hard work to do that work well. And we're going to talk about what it takes to do that well in just a moment. But we began the work with these 10 sites, one of them selected by the Justice Department itself. And in half of the sites, or I think, no, take it back, 3 sites, the program really essentially failed. And part of the reason it failed is that we had not given sufficient attention to what it really took in terms of organizational capacity, in terms of community support to do this work properly. And we really took that information on board and began work with a person operating a nonprofit in Philadelphia called Replication and Program Strategies. Some of you from Pennsylvania will remember this organization, led by a fellow named David Racine. David Racine had as part of one of his funding sources was the Edna McConnell Clark Foundation. And one of the people who was advising Replication and Program Strategies was its president, Mike Balin. And we engaged Replication and Program Strategies and started to develop what became, in the School of Nursing at the University of Colorado, the National Center for Children, Families, and Communities that was set up to replicate the NFP nationally. And we did that for a few years. And at the same time, by the way, we were, I was approached by three incredible people who were involved in the Colorado Lawyers Committee: Bob Hill, Jerry Conover, and Bill Rosser. And they came into my office one day, and they said, "We're here to help." And I looked at them and I thought, well, that's great, but they're attorneys. What do they really want? It turns out that they are remarkable human beings. And out of that work grew a deep commitment to replicating the program here in Colorado called Invest in Kids, which supports the implementation of the program statewide. It led to the 1999 Colorado Nurse Home Visitor Act that brings in, I think I heard Lisa Hill say last night, it brings in about $23 million for the NFP here in Colorado nationally. It's in every one of the counties in the state. And out of that work with Bob, and out of that work that we had started at the National Center for Children and Families and Communities, Mike Balin at the Clark Foundation said, you know something, if you're really going to do this work, you ought to consider doing this outside of the university, because you're not really geared for national replication of this kind of work. And so they awarded a planning grant to Bridgespan, an organization based in Boston that is really an offshoot of a for-profit organization that does nonprofit work in helping promising nonprofit enterprises gain traction to do their work well. And out of that planning work with the through Bridgespan, we eventually created the U.S. National Service Office in 2003, and Bob Hill became the original director, president of the leader of the National Board of Directors. And so the organization that Frank and his leads, and all of you are now associated with, kind of grew out of this history. And in all of this, being the nerd that I am, we needed a model. We needed a model to guide our thinking about what it would take to deliver the program well. And you'll see on this slide on the left side of this figure, I'll try not to have too many of these kinds of slides, but notice the NFP NSO core functions. And at the top of that, it says policy and government affairs. Sarah McGee and her team are leading that work and are making amazing progress in building awareness at the federal and state levels in building support for the program. The marketing communication team has done an amazing job, I think, in communicating the essence of what we do and building a sense of vibrance. It's amazing to me. All of the work that's devoted to site and business development is crucial to help us not make the kinds of mistakes we made in those early efforts at community replication under the Justice Department initiative. The work of this team depends so fundamentally on adequate nurse preparation and support, Kate's team. We need an easy-to-use, I know, information system that can guide implementation of the program and give us feedback about where we stand. And we need a continued commitment to continuous quality improvement and understanding where things are not going well so we can improve it. And at the local level, we need to have some assurance that there is deep appreciation and support within the policy community for this work, that there is broader community appreciation for this work for all the reasons that can be traced back to the work that we did in Elmira. We need organizational commitment and capacity, and we need great team supervisors and nurse home visitors. We need a great team, reflective team process. We have nurses who are passionate and skilled, and we need to engage and respect mothers and fathers because they are at the heart of this program, and they will play an increasingly important role in guiding this program into the future. When we link families with other services and we link other family members with friends and nurses, or mothers and children with family members and friends, a good part of that effort is designed to reduce the terrible adversities that exist in our society today. All of those are critical components of this work, and it's part of the model for community replication. We at the university, in the meantime, are doing the following kinds of things. We are following up the original randomized clinical trials to look at what the impact of the program is on maternal and child health and economic functioning over the life course. We are supporting part of the NFP's research agenda, and we're really doing, I think, an increasingly exciting job of collaborating with the national office and figuring out what part of this are you taking, what part of this are we taking, how can we communicate to get this job done really well. We are supporting the international replication of the program and really requiring that there be independent randomized clinical trials of the program as we replicate it. To the extent that that's feasible. And the team at the university is developing new complementary interventions in the pregnancy and early childhood space. We have a model for thinking about how these various sources of information can be synthesized. I'm not going to bore you with this, but it is, we've tried to be systematic about this. We think in some ways, honestly, that sorting this out, sorting out how we conduct research and remain rigorous to these principles is really going to be important to us, and maybe it might help other interventions as they think about developing their own evidence base and guidance for how to replicate their programs effectively. Every one of the new innovations that we develop undergoes a very rigorous process, and it takes time. We need to really take the time to understand deeply what the program challenges are. We need to, on the basis of understanding what program challenges are, need to really carefully develop, formatively develop these new innovations in the program to make sure we've got it right. And it's in that space that the Innovations Advisory Committee can play a particularly important role. We need to pilot test this to see whether our harebrained ideas are really on track. And then we need to move toward rigorous testing, and when possible, we need to conduct randomized clinical trials. And then we need to figure out how to effectively translate this learning into ongoing practice at all of the levels in the system. We've done work, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we've done work on all of these areas with you following this model. We've done all of this kind of work also following this model. And I say we, I mean we doing this with the national office. And I want to point out that many of you have heard that we are developing and testing a version of the program for women with previous live births. I want to emphasize this. It is in the very early stages of formative development. This is not ready for prime time. We are also trying to dig more deeply to understand the particular challenges that women who are addicted have, and to formulate refinements in our education and our consultation in our practice to address that segment of the population more completely. That's going to require rigorous testing as well. The major priorities, and by the way, I checked with Ellie yesterday to make sure I had these right. The key priorities right now is that we need to enroll both more families with a particular focus on those who are at risk, for all the reasons I've just said. We need to make sure that we're retaining especially those who are at high risk. We need to make sure that we are doing what the nurses did in the original Elmira program, and that is to adjust the content and the dosage of the program to make sure that those who are most vulnerable are getting the full dose, and that those who are not as high risk we're making sensible adjustments in titrating the dosage to risk. And the key in all of this is STAR. And also, I would say, we need to support one another. We really, really do. Because honestly, we know how hard this work is. And either case. I want to just close with just a couple of reflections. Here in the US and around the globe right now, we all feel on a day-to-day, moment-to-moment basis the distress of increasing polarization. In so many ways, it's heartbreaking. You know, and I can tell you, I'm thinking back on some of Georgie's first work with the program in Elmira. Being a black nurse, she would go out on some of the visits to families who were really skeptical about having a black nurse come into their home. And she would come back after some of these visits visibly distressed. And we would reflect on her experience with her. And she would go back on those visits and win these families over. It's an amazing thing. Matt Bervogel, one of the people who's involved in the early replication of the program, relayed this story that he had. He talked with a nurse who was also black and went on her first home visit, and she pulled up in front of this mobile home, and hanging on the outside of the trailer was a Confederate flag. And she took a deep breath and she said, "Am I going into this home?" And she decided, there's a pregnant mom in there, I'm going in. So she did. She walked in the door, and on the wall, when you walked in, was painted a huge swastika. And she started talking to the mother, and the boyfriend wasn't there, but she could hear somebody in the back of the trailer. And she went back for her next visit, and she saw the boyfriend in the kitchen area, kind of rustling around, but kind of paying attention. And eventually, he was part of the visits. And she learned that from the mother that his first reaction in seeing that she was black was, "I ain't having no nurse come into my house." But she kept going because she knew it was important. And she was connecting with this mother. And she eventually connected with this boyfriend. And eventually, she went to the home, and the Confederate flag was taken down. And the swastika painted over. So, we hear stories like this all the time. And even though we know there is terrible polarization out there, this work has the potential to find common ground and pull people together. And I want to just close with this quote. It says, "Do not be arrogant. Do not think that you alone can finish the job. Trust your children and generations yet unborn to take up the task. Know that you are part of the living chain of people who have dreamed, worked for a better world, and carried on the mission." So thank you very much.